Good morning. Today is Tuesday, December the 8th, and Christmas nigh approaches. Yes, today is actually a holy day of Christmas. It is the day of the Immaculate Conception of Christ. Thursday, 2 days from now, is the beginning of Hanukkah. Yes, and Hanukkah is a Jewish holiday that lasts 8 crazy nights, right? But anyway, getting back to what we're supposed to be. I mean, I'm kind of getting excited for the Christmas break. We have a test upcoming this Friday. And so we need to finish this unit, and I think we will do that comfortably. Today, we are going to begin a discussion of something called Enlightened Despots. See that term up there? Enlightened Despots. Enlightened as in enlightenment. What is meant by the term? The word despot means king. The word enlightened basically means smart. You say, what does that mean? It basically means that these were monarchs who, the Enlightenment was the thing. It was the new fad of the latter part of the 18th century, and people were starting to get it. And if you were hip, deaf, and jamming, then you understood also. And so basically these enlightened despots were monarchs who wanted to show that they indeed were intellectuals and, and had their own ways of showing it. So, as it says, though, even though they supported the ideas of the Enlightenment, were they sincere in allowing rule by the common man? That's a good question, and the answer is when push came to shove, when things got really, well, like, for example, during the French Revolution, which is our next unit, the answer is most a resounding no. But for right now, when there's no big turmoil going on, yeah, sure, I'm smart. Yeah, sure, I get it. Yeah, sure, I believe in science, even though, once again, keep in mind that the words science and scientist will not be used until the latter part of the 19th century. They just call themselves educated. Now, these changes in the Enlightenment monarchs, these enlightened despots, were motivated by two desires. One, they wanted to make their own country stronger by utilizing some of the advancements of the new science. And two, they wanted to make their own rule more effective. They wanted to, once again, appear more, and I hate to use this term again, hip, deaf, and jamming, with it, understanding, wise. Now, I have here three absolute or enlightened despots who were absolute monarchs who are worth mentioning. Frederick the Great of Prussia. I don't know that we've mentioned the country of Prussia too much thus far, but Prussia basically is the country that one day will become Germany. So yeah, Frederick the Great of Prussia was committed to reforming his own country. He granted religious freedom, and that's, once again, that's forward thinking, that's enlightened, reduced censorship of the press, and also improved education. I mean, the finest education system in all of Europe was a German education. In fact, the word kindergarten, which I'm sure most of you went to, I did not, but is obviously, you can tell, is a German word. Kinder means children, Garten means, well, garden. Yeah, but the idea for kindergarten, of starting an early education, came under the reign of Frederick the Great of Prussia. He also, another thing he did was to introduce the potato to Prussia. We haven't talked enough about potato, but we will. The potato, of course, is a crop that came from the Americas, And while it grew well in America, it really grew well in the acidic soil of Europe with lots of rain. And also, you could get about 10 times more calories, and calories are not a bad thing when you're starving, 10 times more calories out of an acre of potatoes than you could an acre of wheat with a lot less trouble. He did that. He also abolished the use of torture to gain confession of criminal acts. I say that's enlightened. Abolish the use of torture to gain confessions of criminal acts. Did he abolish serfdom? No. Did he believe serfdom was wrong? Yes, he did. Serfdom will be abolished by the French Revolution, but we'll get to that later. Now, probably the most enlightened, and I mean, this guy really embraced the enlightened thought and really wanted to change the world, make the world better, was Joseph II of Austria. Joseph II of Austria, the brother of Marie Antoinette of France. He was the most radical reformer of them all. He introduced legal reforms, freedom of the press, freedom of worship of Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews living in the Austrian Empire. And that was that was quite a thing. A ruler who actually made allowances for Jews. He abolished serfdom. Now, he abolished serfdom and had serfs paid in money, which had never been done before. However, his reforms were so, he didn't have anybody, nobody else believed what he was doing. Nobody else believed in what he was doing. And so when he died, all his reforms were repealed. Particularly when you keep in mind the fact that his death came about the time of the French Revolution, and the French Revolution reform just was not a good thing. Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great is probably the most interesting of all the enlightened despots. She was a woman who ruled in a man's world and did it in her own way. First of all, Catherine the Great was not Russian. She was actually, as it says there, from Prussia. She was German. And we'll talk about this more later on. All Prussians are German, but not all Germans are Prussians. Yeah, not all Germans are alike. Pardon me. I mean, for example, Austrians are Germans, Bavarians are Germans, Hanoverians are Germans, and there are lots of different ethnicities, subgroups within the German peoples, and of course, Prussians are German. But anyway, she was a minor princess from Prussia, and she was brought to Russia to marry Peter III. And Peter III, this is not Peter the Great, this is his great-grandson, Peter III, was the ultimate bumbling fool. And she caught on to this really fast, that Peter III was, playing with a shortened deck, so to speak. And so she had him put out of the way, murdered. Yeah. And what it was part of his own this guy Peter III was a loon. He loved to dress up in uniforms, and he loved military discipline. He wanted to fancy himself an officer, and he commanded his own army. I mean, one night Catherine comes to their bedchamber, and the guy's got all these dead rats dressed up in Prussian military uniforms, and one rat hanging over her bed, and I mean hanging by the neck, and he pointed this rat out to her and said he was a traitor and had to be executed. And she, somebody who plays with dead rats, ooh, yeah. And pardon me. She eventually, she got married to the guy, but she really didn't. Like to be honest, most royal marriages, love doesn't have a lot to do with it. And this guy grossed her out, as you might imagine. And so she found other ways to amuse herself, although she did give him one son. His name was Paul. And after that, she started trying to find ways to get out of their marriage. And the best way to get out of their marriage was to make sure their husband wasn't there anymore. And so, when it says she had Peter III put out of the way, when Peter was on military campaign with the Russian army in a war against Prussia, and and fighting Prussia was no small feat. The Prussians were the best soldiers in Europe were Germans, were Prussian. And yet the Russians were prevailing. They were marching, advancing literally to the gates of Berlin, the capital city of Prussia. And Peter III said, you know what, guys? See, he really idolized Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia. You know what, guys? Maybe we should just go home. Let's call this whole thing off. And he told his generals that. One of his generals was a guy named Gregory Orlov, who was one of the 27 official lovers that Catherine the Great kept in her lifetime. And General Gregory Orlov and several of his companions snatched up the king and literally beat him to death. Put his body in a box, shipped it back to Moscow. Of course, that would take several weeks. His body would decompose, and so there was no autopsy done. But yeah, they claimed, of course, he died of some illness, which was not uncommon. At any rate, she was now the Tsarina of Russia. She formed a commission to review Russia's laws based on the ideas of Montesquieu and Grigory Bakaria, the great thinker on crimes and punishment. Allowed some religious toleration, but not Jews, not Jews, not Jews. She did not like Jews. Abolished torture and capital punishment for the short term. And what happened was, as it says there, Catherine's ideas on reform were changed when a massive peasant uprising, the Pugachev's Rebellion, it was called, in 1773. Which had to be put down. And the thing about it was, once she put down that rebellion, she said, you know what, this reform business, all this Enlightenment stuff, it sounds good on paper, but no. No, 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 no. And so, yeah, had the revolt put down with no mercy. She needed the noble support to maintain power, and so she allowed serfdom to continue, gave the nobility, started making concessions. By the way, I mean, Catherine the Great, you should look her up sometime as far as Google her up. She was an interesting lady, had a voracious sexual appetite. When it says up there she had 27 lovers in her lifetime, that's what it means. These, by the way, were official lovers. Their job was to service the desires of the queen. And when she got tired of them, she would like send them away. And she would like pay them a pension or something. Made one of them the king of Poland, in fact. Anyway, she gave the nobility absolute power over the serfs. Her greatest successes, however, were in foreign affairs, in particular acquiring land along the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, something Peter the Great could not do. Peter the great Russian Tsar. She also gained the right to send her navy through the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, which is something that the Russians don't even have the right to do today. She also gained, which was of great importance to the Russians. She also participated in the Tripartitioning of Poland with Austria and Prussia in 1793. In 1793, Poland is going to disappear, literally, as a country. Too bad, too. Poland's one of my favorite countries. I've actually been there twice. It's a very interesting country. We'll have to talk about it sometime. But anyway, the tripartitioning of Poland, that occurred in 1793. Basically, Russia, Prussia, and Austria each took a slice of Poland. And Poland will disappear as a country. It will no longer exist as a country until after World War I, 1918. Okay, let's talk about this thing called the American Revolution, which is included in the Age of Enlightenment. Once again, the Age of Enlightenment goes from 1687 to 1789. And within those 102 years falls the American Revolution. And the American Revolution is supposed to be about the ideas of the Enlightenment. Now, notice I said supposed to be. Yeah, I mean, the American Revolution is supposed to be about freedom and all those kind of good things. The American Revolution was the first time the theories of the Enlightenment were actually put into practice with the new American Republic. And now, that is something that this country can be proud of. They actually took these ideas from the Enlightenment, which, before the American Revolution, the ideas of the Enlightenment were nothing more than that. They were just ideas. No one had ever tried to put them into practice. And if you want to be proud of your American country, which I am, that would be a reason to be proud. But a lot of times we spend way too much time talking about the fact that, the American Revolution was about freedom of speech, and freedom, no taxation without representation, and all those wonderful ideas. But to be real honest, the American Revolution, like so many other things on this planet, is about one thing: money. Money. Take, for example, George Washington. You might have heard of that guy. George Washington was a farmer. I'm sorry. Farmer. He was a tobacco farmer, a Virginia planter. And, George Washington had a successful farm. I get mad when I start talking about George Washington. George Washington had 187 slaves. And he was very much a believer in slavery, very much. And he produced tobacco on his farm. And, he was angry with the British government because, see, according to the laws of mercantilism, which is what we'll talk about later down on part 4, according to the laws of mercantilism, George Washington was only allowed to charge so much money for his tobacco, and he could only sell it to the British. The British East India Tea Company, East India Company, the big purchasing conglomerates in Great Britain, they set the price at which George Washington could sell his commodities to. And with that price, George Washington was barely making ends meet. And George Washington and many colonials like him were very upset with the fact they couldn't make any money. And so they said, let's do something about it. The founding fathers of this country, boys and girls, were all rich white guys. End of story. Just like the founding fathers of the French Revolution, all rich white guys. The ones who were the leadership. Of course, now, here's the problem. Now, how do you revolt? Because when you revolt, it takes a lot of bodies. It takes people to staff your armies. It takes people to carry muskets, commit acts of violence, throw off your oppressor. Well, how do you convince these? And those guys, the ones who did all the fighting and dying in the American Revolution, the great majority of them were poor people. How do you convince them to pick up arms and risk their lives for you to be richer? Answer: you can't. And so you lie about it. You say you don't talk about the fact that I want to be able to make more money. You talk about the fact that, we're fighting for freedom. Yeah, freedom of speech. But anyway, let's look at these causes of the American Revolution. One of the big causes was physical separation of the 13 colonies, and England. Think of it. Think of this. Think of this. Think of this. Most English people who came to this country made the trip across the Atlantic, a trip that even then took a month. Made the trip exactly one time. They never went back. Now, so they come here and they settle in, and coming to the colonies was no guarantee of success. Lots of people who came here failed, lots of them. But once you came here and you got settled, you probably did correspond, write letters back and forth to mom and dad. And when mom and dad died, you probably continued to write letters to your siblings, your brothers and sisters, maybe aunts and uncles for that matter. But then when you died and they died, did your children continue to write letters to the children, their own cousins? I think not. And so, no, people they'd never met. And so I think within one generation, literally within one generation, you had two separate, they were strangers. They were related, but they were strangers. Also, if you look at part number two, the two regions, Britain and the 13 colonies, had become different societies. You say, what does that mean? Well, what mattered in England was different than what mattered in the 13 colonies. You say, what does that mean? Well, in England, no matter how hard you worked, the thing that mattered was basically who's your daddy. You say, what does that mean? Well, your birth. What is your heritage? Were you a member of nobility? If you were not a member of nobility, your chances of being a success were severely hampered. Not impossible. In the rest of Europe, it was impossible, but in Britain, it was not impossible, but yeah, you were at a severe disadvantage. Remember, in Britain, every single inch of land, every single inch of property in Britain had been owned for 1,000 years. Someone owned it. And chances of you owning your own land in Britain were little, slim, and none. But in the Americas, there was land for the taking. If you wanted land, all you had to do was to simply go out and find something that somebody else hadn't claimed. But now, as you and I know, claiming land was a lot different than actually succeeding. I mean, once again, lots of people came to this country and starved. Lots of people came and died of disease. Lots of people came and tried to establish a home somewhere on the frontier, and their houses were burned and they were murdered by Native Americans who were defending their own territory, but that's another story. But yeah, success was not guaranteed. And so in the 13 colonies, what mattered was not who your daddy was, and was not even if you owned land. What mattered was, what can you do? Can you take the resources that are available and make something of it? Part three. Yes, you have to give credit to the influx of Enlightenment ideas in 13 colonies. I mean, all of the 13 colonies had colonial legislatures that were established in accordance with the ideas of the Enlightenment. I mean, they had differing laws regarding things like, well, religious freedom. For the longest time, the only religion allowed in Massachusetts was Puritanism. Maryland, for example, was the only one of the 13 colonies that allowed Roman Catholicism. Georgia was a penal colony, a colony for convicts. And so the colonies were, but there was a measurable amount of freedom, and they all had legislatures, and people elected them, of course, in the colonies to vote. Most of them had regulations that you had to own land. But once again, owning land in the 13 colonies was not that big of a deal. But the big one is here. The rediscovery by the Minister of the Exchequer, Minister of the Exchequer, that is what we would call the Secretary of the Treasury, the guy whose job it is to raise money for the government or to find ways to make money for the government. His name's Sir George Grenville. And Grenville said, you know what? Our British government, which was heavily in debt, could actually get out of debt if they would just enforce the mercantilist laws. See, I told you that was coming. The laws of mercantilism, which we've talked about before, that were on the books, such as, the colonies are not supposed to smuggle. They're not supposed to trade with anybody but Great Britain. They're not supposed to have currency, and all kind of these things, such as the Navigation Act. But for the past 200 years that the British had colonies, 150 years in the New World, smuggling had been going on out in the open, quite out in the open. Okay, and let's begin with this. This is just a question. How do you think a British textbook would explain and deal with the American Revolution? I'll tell you what, they wouldn't say it was about freedom. They wouldn't say that the British government was being abusive. They wouldn't say that the British government was abusing the rights of the Americans. No, it would take a different slant. And so I'm going to stop there, and we'll finish this chapter Thursday. Yes, we will. All right, and so bye for now.